Hello and welcome to this Revision Monkey video on what's going to be in the 2022 exams. This video is for the AQA specification and it's for combined scientists, and that's the trilogy conversion of combined science, which means you do 6 papers at the end of your course, all of which are 1 hour and 15 minutes long. This video is for biology paper 2 and it's for higher tier students. So first of all, let's look at what won't be assessed in the paper. The following topics we've been told won't be assessed, and these are the human nervous system, contraception, sexual and asexual reproduction, DNA and the genome, genetic inheritance, inherited disorders, sex determination, variation and evolution, the development of understanding of genetics and evolution, adaptations, land use, and deforestation. But the exam board have told you the required practical to focus on, and that is organism distribution. Do keep an eye out in the description because I'll put a link there for a required practical video that specifically goes through this practical for you. The exam board have also told us the topics that will be the major focus of this exam, and these are hormonal control in humans, organisation of an ecosystem, and biodiversity and the effect of human interaction on an ecosystem. So the rest of this topic covers the content for these major foci, and it also removes anything that they've told you won't be assessed on the paper. Do keep an eye out in the description as well, because as well as the required practical video, I'll also try and put a link in there for some questions based on these topics of major focus. The endocrine system is a really difficult word just to describe glands that produce hormones. Controlling our body by hormones is slower than that of nerves, than a nerve response. It acts in a more general way. And usually the response lasts longer. Now there are several endocrine glands that you need to be aware of. The most important one here in your head is called the pituitary gland, and that has got a little bit of a nickname called the master gland because that is often responsible for switching on and off other endocrine glands in your body. The one in your throat here is called the thyroid gland. That produces a hormone called thyroxine. The pituitary gland produces lots of hormones that we'll talk about later as well. The adrenal glands here, they produce adrenaline. You've got the pancreas here, a really important gland that produces lots of different hormones, and we'll talk about the pancreas later on too. And depending on whether you're male or female, females have ovaries, and we'll talk about those when we talk about the menstrual cycle, and the men have testes, and the hormone that's produced there is testosterone. We're going to look now at the pancreas in a little bit more detail because we're going to talk about one of the things that's important in homeostasis, which is controlling the blood sugar levels. So the pancreas is involved in controlling blood sugar levels because it produces a hormone called insulin. It's something that your bodies will produce all of the time, and what the insulin does is if there's too much glucose in your blood, I'll just represent the glucose by a G. If there's too much glucose in your blood, the pancreas will start producing more insulin, and that will cause the glucose to go into your muscle and your liver cells. And here it can be stored as glycogen. So the liver itself stores glucose as glycogen. So difficult words here. Glucose and glycogen sound very similar, but if the blood glucose levels are too high, it is controlled by this hormone, insulin. This next bit is for higher tier only, just this slide here, because you also need to know what happens when the blood glucose levels get too low. The pancreas produces another hormone, this time called glucagon. Again, annoyingly very similar to the words glycagon and glucose that we looked at earlier. So glucagon is a hormone produced in the pancreas, and what that will do is it will cause the liver to turn that glycogen into glucose again, which will then go back into our blood. So it does the opposite of the process that insulin does that we talked about before. So higher tier only need to know about glucagon. If the blood glucose levels are too low, glucagon helps convert glycogen into glucose, which is put back into the blood. This is an example of a negative feedback cycle. So if your blood sugar levels get high and then low and then high again, your main goal is to keep them at as close to their optimum level as you can. So if the glucose levels get too high, your body will produce insulin and make them go low again. If the glucose levels get too low, your body will produce glucagon and therefore increase the blood glucose levels again, and it kind of wavers around this optimum midpoint. And the trouble with controlling blood glucose is it is linked to a disorder called diabetes. There are two types. Type 1 diabetes is the type that is inherited, and in this type of diabetes, your body produces little or no insulin. And this is the type of diabetes that the doctor will prescribe insulin therapy, so that involves insulin injections. And you have to keep a close monitor of the glucose intake that you're taking into your body. If your blood glucose gets really low, you will quickly eat some biscuits or some foods that are high in glucose, and you also need to regularly remember to go and get your insulin injections. Type 2 diabetes, however, is caused by lifestyle factors. It's often linked to diet and obesity, and you get that later on in life. And it's when you still produce insulin, but your body is resistant to your own insulin. So basically it becomes no longer is effective. So you're still producing it, but it's not working anymore. It's not reducing your blood sugars to normal. So your doctor will prescribe, in this case, a carbohydrate controlled diet. Because remembering back from topics on diet, the carbohydrates in paper 1 can be broken down into sugars like glucose. So we need to control the amount of carbohydrates we're taking into our diet, and also he or she will suggest an exercise routine as well to help maintain your weight, which is obviously a risk factor in terms of diabetes. Still on the theme of hormones, we're going to look at hormones that are involved in the menstrual cycle now. So here we still have the endocrine system on the right hand side here. At the top we have the pituitary gland, and this produces follicle stimulating hormone, which is FSH, and it also produces luteinizing hormone, LH. You need to know what these two do. This follicle stimulating hormone causes the egg to mature, and the luteinizing hormone here, the LH, causes the egg to release. The other endocrine glands that are involved in this process are the ovaries, and they produce two hormones called estrogen and progesterone, and these two are involved in growing and maintaining the uterus lining. So the uterus of a woman will be just below where the ovaries are. The ovaries will link to the uterus via an oviduct, and this is where, if the woman becomes pregnant, a baby will develop. So if we look at the uterus lining, it links into the menstrual cycle because the menstrual cycle is a 28-day cycle. If I draw this diagram as if it's the width of the uterus, first of all, in the first few days, 4 to 5 days of the cycle, the uterus lining breaks down. And at this point, it will then be your menstruation period. Okay, it's shortened to the period. So that's your period of menstruation, when the woman will bleed and the uterus lining will break down. The uterus lining will then build up again with the help of estrogen and progesterone, and then will be maintained. Day 14 is an important day because that is the day in which the egg is released. And then the cycle will all happen again and the uterus lining will start to break down, etc. For higher tier, you need to know how these interact. So if you're doing foundation tier, feel free to skip on to the next slide. For higher tier, you need to know that when FSH is produced, not only does it cause the egg to mature, but it also stimulates estrogen production. So we said before that the pituitary gland was a master gland. Well, in this way, the FSH travels from the pituitary gland to the ovaries. It will cause an egg to mature, and it will also then stimulate the ovaries to start producing estrogen. What happens then, however, is the estrogen that's produced from the ovaries will travel and signal to the pituitary gland, and that will do two things. The estrogen inhibits the FSH, and it will also stimulate LH, which is going to then cause the release of the egg. The other connection you need to know is that progesterone, which is involved in maintaining the uterus lining, also inhibits FSH. And LH as well. So at this point here, the estrogen does not is stopping further eggs from maturing. So each month you only want one egg maturing. So what that estrogen is doing is stopping more eggs maturing and then causing that one egg to be released. This next little bit on IVF is higher tier only. IVF is a way of increasing your fertility, and it is quite an intensive process and an expensive process, but it increases a chance of them getting pregnant. So what would happen first of all is the woman would inject herself with FSH and LH, remembering these are the two hormones involved in FSH maturing the egg and LH releasing the egg. So the purpose of this is so that the woman will generate multiple eggs, and then those eggs are taken from the woman, and the man will provide a sample of sperm, and in a lab the sperm is injected into the healthiest looking eggs. So they will look at the sperm and they will look at the eggs and they will put the healthiest specimens of sperm and egg together. So the sperm, once it's injected into the egg, will make a fertilised egg, and if that's successful, that will start dividing, and a few balls of cells together is called an embryo. That embryo is then implanted in the uterus of the woman. And with IVF, you can have 1 or 2 embryos implanted to increase your chances of success. There are downsides, including multiple births, which can cause problems for both the mother and the baby. Sometimes it's not successful, and in fact, quite a few times IVF is not successful, so you've paid thousands of pounds and don't have a baby at the end of the procedure. It's very stressful on both the mother and the father, especially the mother with the injections of all the hormones. But the ultimate goal and the ultimate advantage is that people that find it hard to have children can do so. This next topic is higher tier only as well, and it's focusing on 2 hormones called adrenaline and thyroxine. Adrenaline is produced in the adrenal glands, and it is responsible for your response to fear and stress. So in situations of fear and stress, adrenaline is released. You need to know that the release of the adrenaline causes an increase in oxygen and glucose to your cells, particularly in the brain and your muscles. Brain so that you can think and coordinate your response, and the muscles so that you can move quickly and react. It will cause an increase in heart rate, and it will therefore trigger a fight or flight response, which means either you are going to fight in response to that fear or stress situation, or you are going to have the opportunity to run and flee from that situation. I would suggest learning this response, because this could be a higher tier style question in the exam. The other one that you need to know is thyroxine. This is produced in the thyroid gland, and this is responsible for your resting metabolic rate, which is called your basal metabolic rate. So this is the metabolic rate whilst you're at rest, and thyroxine is responsible for keeping that the same. It is also controlled by a hormone in the pituitary gland called the thyroid stimulating hormone, and it's involved in a negative feedback cycle. If you look at the thyroxine levels in blood, they will go up and down, but these levels are controlled by the presence of TSH. So if the thyroxine levels get too high, that TSH will be inhibited and stopped. If the thyroxine levels in the blood drop too low, that TSH in the pituitary gland will be stimulated and start being produced to stimulate the production of thyroxine. Next, we're going to look at food chains. It's quite a simple concept, but there are lots of important words involved. This is the idea that we can link organisms in a community depending on what organism eats what. For example, in this food chain we have the grass, which is then eaten by the grasshopper, which is then eaten by the mouse, and which is finally eaten by the owl. So a few key words. First of all, this grass here, and always at the beginning of the food chain you have something called a producer. This is because it produces its own food by a process called photosynthesis. Where that process gets its energy from originally is the sun. So energy is transferred to the plants, and they use that energy from the sun to make their own food. That is then consumed by the grasshopper. So all of these three organisms here are called consumers, but this one is the primary consumer because it is the first consumer in the chain. The mouse is what we call the secondary consumer because it is the second organism in the food chain, and the owl is called the tertiary consumer. Now, we don't have a continual line of organisms here. Within a food chain, you only tend to have 4 or 5 or maybe up to half a dozen organisms. After that, it stops. Now, the reason for that is because not all of the biomass is passed up the food chain. That means not all of the mass of each organism is passed up each food chain. Because, for example, perhaps the grasshopper can't eat all of the different parts of the plant. Perhaps there's some structures that it can't consume. The mouse, for example, might not eat all of the grasshopper. Maybe it leaves out its wings or its legs because they find those inedible. And the owl, for example, won't digest all of the mouse. It will swallow all of the mouse, but then it will bring up things like its fur and any of the hard bones that it can't digest. So by the time it gets to the end of the food chain, there is not enough energy for another organism. Energy is wasted in other ways as well, for example, through the movement of the organisms, through the fact that they produce feces, and as we said before, the fact that there are inedible, which means they can't be eaten, parts of the organism. So by the time you get to the end, there's just simply not enough energy for another organism to fit into the food chain. That's why the arrows face in this direction. They show the direction of energy transferred. So they always have to be in this direction, moving from the producers through to the consumers. A couple of extra keywords then. We would describe the owl as a predator, and we would describe, for example, the mouse as prey. Anything that's eaten is called prey, and anything that's doing the eating is called the predator. So in the same way, the grasshopper would be the prey for the mouse, and the mouse would be the predator of the grasshopper. Next, we're going to look at a required practical for paper 2, which is all about how organisms are distributed. And this required practical is all about the idea of random sampling of a population. Population being one species, if you remember from the keywords that we looked at before. For example, if you had a very large area, say 100 metres by 100 metres, you might want to estimate the number of a particular organism that is in that area. For example, the one that's often used at school is you might want to measure or estimate the number of daisies in a particular field, and you might want to compare two different fields, sunny versus shady, for example, or different fields with different pHs, perhaps different fields with different grass types as well. There's lots of things that you could look at, but the main thing is that you can't sample the whole field. It would be too time consuming and nigh on impossible to go and calculate the number of daisies in that field. What we can do is we can subsample a much smaller area of the field. It's not to scale, but for example, we could have an area that was 10 metres by 10 metres. And what you do is you divide that grid up again with string. So there we have it. We have a grid in the middle of our field, and we've divided that grid up into 100 squares. So if we were to write a method for this, or start writing a method, we would first of all write that we would measure an area 10 by 10 metres and divide this up into a grid with squares of 1 metre by 1 metre. Then still within that grid we can't sample all of the different squares within there. So what we need to do is we need to use a random number generator, and we need to use that to pick, for example, 10 or 20 squares that we are going to sample. They'll ask you about this in the exam perhaps. The more squares you sample, the more reliable your results are going to be. So we can use a random number generator. So for example, if we assigned these squares from top left to bottom right, 1 to 100, so we'd go along and say that was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. We could then use our random number generator and say, for example, that it picked out 10 squares at random. We would then sample within those 10 squares, and what would we use is a grid that looks very similar to this called a quadrat. So a quadrat is a metal grid. Sometimes they are 1 metres by 1 metres, it depends on the quadrat you've got. Other quadrats are a bit smaller, perhaps 0.5 metres by 0.5 metres or something like that. So you need to be aware of how big a quadrat you're using. I'm going to suggest we're going to use a 1 metre by 1 metre quadrat, and what we do, we would then place that on one of our sampling squares, and we would count the number of daisies within that quadrat. So we can build up our method here. We've used a random number generator, and now we are going to count the number of daisies in each of the 10 squares by placing a quadrat over the grid square and counting the organisms we find, or counting the daisies in this case that we find. And we would repeat that for each of our 10 squares, and then we would take an average number of daisies per quadrat, and then we would then have an average number of daisies per metres squared. And with that information, you can then compare that to a shady field, repeating it in the same way, measuring an area, dividing it up into a grid, using a random number generator to pick, for example, 10 squares, placing a quadrat on those squares and counting the number of daisies within the quadrat. The second way that you can sample organisms is by using a transect. This is slightly different, although it does use those metal grids that we used before called quadrats. It doesn't have to use quadrats, but it can do. For example, what you might want to do is look at the distribution of organisms in a straight line away from a tree. And what you would do was you'd lay down your measuring tape, which is your transect line, and you would lay that down on the ground away from the tree. Then, at regular intervals, for example, every metre or every 2 metres, you would sample the organisms. And to do that, you could either just count the number of organisms that were touching your tape measure or your piece of string that you put down as your transect line, or you could place your quadrat there and count the number of organisms that you find within your quadrat. Not only could you do that in a horizontal way, you can also do transects vertically, for example, up a tree. you could lay a piece of string or a measuring tape up a tree and sample something like leaf size or lichen cover as you go up the tree. So you might not want to use a quadrat, or you might just want to have a look at regular intervals next to that string line or tape measure. You might want to measure the size of the lichen that you find. In the same way that you can do that on a wall, for example, here you could lay a transect vertically on the wall, and next to the transect at regular intervals you could either place a small quadrat, or you could simply measure the size of the lichen at that point. With a quadrat, not only might you want to count the number of organisms, but for some organisms this is particularly difficult. And instead, you might want to calculate the percentage cover in the quadrat instead. And you may well be asked to do that in the exam. So, for example, if I draw a very, very small, simple quadrat that is 5 squares by 5 squares, in total there are 25 squares. And let's say, for example, that we put this on the wall and we had a particular coverage of lichen, like so. We would count the squares that are covered with lichen. In this case, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 squares that are covered in lichen, and we would use that to calculate the percentage cover. So you do the number of squares with the organism in it divided by the total number of squares, and then multiply by 100 to get your percentage. So in this case we've got 5 divided by 25 multiplied by 100, and that will give us our percentage cover of 20%. We're now going to look at the water cycle. The water cycle basically explains how on Earth the water is constantly cycled around and reused. So there's some important key words. First of all, evaporation. So this could be water evaporating from the sea, for example. That water would evaporate, and when it gets higher up in the atmosphere, it would cool down and it would condense into clouds. So we've got first evaporation and then condensation. As those clouds move around, at some point they will then turn into rainfall, and this is called precipitation, and that rain will fall back down onto the earth. At this point it might flow, for example, into rivers, straight back into the sea, or it might get taken up by plants, and when plants take up water, that water can then be evaporated from their leaves. So this comes up in paper 1 as well, this process whereby plants take up water and evaporate it from their leaves, and this is called transpiration. So in this process here, through evaporation, condensation, precipitation, flow back into the rivers, and transpiration, that is how the water is cycled on our planet. So a lot of key words there. You might see, for example, the idea that if you have some water in an iceberg, for example, on the sea, they might ask you to suggest how that water ends up in a lake. So here you would have the iceberg melting into the sea, that water evaporating, condensing into clouds, and then you would have the precipitation that would lead to the rainfall filling up the lake. Further to the water cycle, you also need to know how carbon is cycled. So carbon is a compound that you're probably well aware is in the gas carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide has a major involvement in moving this carbon around the atmosphere, but it doesn't always have to involve carbon dioxide. Let's start over here first of all. Photosynthesis is part of the carbon cycle because plants take in carbon dioxide and then they add that to water that they take up through their roots, and they make a substance called glucose and oxygen. And that you'll see balanced out with sixes in front of the oxygen, the water and the carbon dioxide. So this process, it takes the carbon from the gas here and turns it into, cycles it so that it then goes into this molecule here, which is glucose. Animals will then eat the plants, and therefore they will consume the carbon here from this glucose molecule, and that will be taken in by the animal. Animals will then both respire and produce waste, so some of the carbon will be in the waste here, but it'll also be released by the animal as CO2 when the animal respires. Plants also respire. So the respiration from animals and plants will again release CO2 back into the atmosphere. When the animal and the plants die, the carbon that is in these organisms will be recycled through the process of decay. Microorganisms are mainly responsible for decay. So the microorganisms will feed on the dead plants and animals, and they will also respire. It's not just the larger animals and plants that you think of as respiring, but also these microorganisms are respiring, and therefore they are also releasing CO2 back into the atmosphere. Vehicle emissions are also responsible for releasing carbon dioxide. So the carbon starts off first of all locked up in fossil fuels as the hydrocarbons, and then when they are burned through a combustion reaction, that is, as we looked at in the chemistry topic, combustion results in carbon dioxide and water being released, and that is another way that carbon is cycled. And finally, factory emissions. So they are burning fossil fuels, also releasing CO2 into the atmosphere, and this completes the carbon cycle. This next section looks at how humans are impacting on Earth, and often this is in a negative way. So in recent years, we've seen a massive population rise of people, verging on the 7.5 billion people on the planet. And this has massive consequences for a number of resources such as water, land and air. The presence of these billions and billions of peoples has meant that water is regularly contaminated with sewage and other toxic chemicals. Another way water is contaminated is through agriculture. So there's a lot of use of chemicals, fertilisers on the land, and these can, what we call, run off the land into the rivers and can contaminate the water sources, therefore affecting animal and plant life within the water. We contaminate the land in a number of ways, one of the big ones being landfill, so putting all of our waste and sometimes toxic chemicals into massive areas on the land. So having toxic waste on there obviously pollutes the soils, which makes it difficult to ever be used for anything else again after the landfill. There's lots of chemicals on there. And one problem that we've had in generating more electricity is the use of nuclear fuel to do that, and we have a problem with nuclear waste and where we can store that, because wherever that is stored, that will cause massive contamination. So we pollute the air in a number of ways. when we burn fuels, we have solid particulates released. This links into chemistry topic as well, and this can lead to global dimming. We have chemicals such as sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides released, and they can lead to acid rain. The main problem with all of that pollution is that it is leading to a reduction in biodiversity. We said before that bio is the living things and diversity is the variety of living things that we have on our planet. The more diverse our planet is, the better it is for sustainability and future populations. However, our impact on the water, land and air ultimately is reducing that biodiversity by causing local populations of animals and plant life to become extinct. And this is the definition for biodiversity that you need to know: the variety of different species of organisms on Earth or within an ecosystem. We'll now move on to global warming, which is a topic that comes up in chemistry as well. So with global warming, the main gases that are involved create a layer in the atmosphere, and these gases are carbon dioxide and methane, and to a lesser extent water vapour as well. These greenhouse gases, as we call them, create a layer in the atmosphere. You won't probably have to go into this much detail in biology, however, as it goes across both subjects, it's really important to know anyway. The sun releases shortwave radiation, and that goes straight through the greenhouse gases. But when it hits the Earth, that is reflected as long-wave radiation, and this does not get through the greenhouse gases. This is re-radiated back in all directions, including back to Earth's. So it allows short-wave radiation through, but the long-wave radiation that's reflected from Earth is re-radiated. And it's because this long-wave radiation is a form of thermal radiation, this will cause the Earth to warm and heat up. So there are a number of different consequences associated with global warming, like we've talked about previously: a reduction in biodiversity. And this is to do with a number of different factors. It could be rising sea levels, and this will cause problems for humans as well. It could cause a change in organism distribution or in migratory patterns. So those animals that are able to migrate and move, they might choose to live in slightly different areas and slightly different regions because of the changing temperatures on the planet. It could cause a change in rainfall. That could be more rainfall in some areas and less in others, so it could cause droughts or severe rainfall depending on where you are, and also more extreme weather events. So after all the doom and gloom about how humans are reducing the biodiversity on Earth, a little bit of positive news on how we are trying to maintain biodiversity. So there are several programs that are put into place to protect wildlife and maintain biodiversity. Some of these are government led and other of these are charities or not-for-profit organisations. One example of a program is within the countryside to maintain or reinstall hedgerows. allowing the landscape to be less fragmented and providing pathways for animals to travel more easily between different areas within their habitat. And the introduction of these field margins. And this is when farmer leaves a little bit of land set aside away from the field. So here he would have all his monoculture crops, so one individual crop, he won't want any weeds on there, he might be spraying chemicals on there, but at the side of the land just has this wild habitat available to increase the biodiversity within the farmland. So here we could have plants suitable for bees and insects and loads of other wildlife, whereas here we have our crops growing. Linking into this, there are the major habitat regeneration programs. So, for example, money might be invested into regenerating wetlands or regenerating ancient woodlands. There's breeding programs that are linked into zoos and specialist breeding centres to try and increase and release the number of rare species in the world. So, for example, if you wanted to reintroduce water voles in particular areas, there are organisations involved in breeding those water voles and making sure they have a successful release into the wild. In general, we can all recycle, and there are major schemes encouraging us to recycle, reuse, especially with the changes in the laws of plastic bags, and reduce how much we are consuming. Finally, the government may have very particular commitments to carbon dioxide release. So they might put tariffs on very major companies to make sure that they're not releasing so much carbon dioxide into the environment. They may have incentives for them and rewards or sanctions if they do release too much carbon dioxide into the environment over the course of a year, for example. So all of these things will work to help maintain and improve the biodiversity. However, there are conflicting pressures with all of these programs that you might have to evaluate in the exam. So things such as the cost. A lot of these programs have a high cost. There is also a very close debate between the importance of biodiversity versus food security. So food security is making sure that we have enough food to feed all of the human population. And you can imagine, for example, the idea of these field margins would have a very close debate between the need for these field margins for biodiversity, but also the fact that they take away from an area where you could grow crops, so it could be affecting our food security in the future. Also, for other countries that are finding it very difficult to grow enough food to maintain their populations, well then it's very difficult to try and get governments to instill very particular commitments on those countries when they are going to want to cut down trees, to grow food, etc. And then this really leads on to the final conflicting pressure that countries can't agree. There's a lot of politics involved in setting these sanctions by the government, and very large meetings between a number of different countries to try and agree to the amount of carbon dioxide that each country is releasing. And sometimes they just don't agree because there's different levels of development in the country, and there's not an easy solution to please everybody. So that brings us to the end of the revision video for Biology Paper 2. I do hope you found it useful, and best of luck in your exam.